there's something that's a little intimidating and something that creates a lot of pressure and even a little bit of stress when you're the one tasked with carrying out a loved one's final request. No matter what the request might be, there's always that pressure on yourself to fulfill that desire because you love and you respect the person who's passed away, because you care about them, because you want to do what they've asked you to do. But what if that person's final request to you might actually cause you some pain? What if their final request of your loved one was not just painful, but even a little offensive for you to carry out? I recently came across this story, and maybe you've heard it too. It made its way online, and since it's from the internet, you know it has to be true. But the story has kind of stuck with me after I've read it and stuff. See, apparently there was this guy who redefined the meaning of the word cheap. This guy worked hard his entire life. He saved everything that he possibly could. Those who knew him theorized that every single penny the man had to his name had visible fingerprints from how hard he pinched them. He lived in the cheapest house he could find. He wore hand-me-downs and stuff he bought at thrift stores. The only furniture he ever owned, he bought at estate sales, just so he could make everything in his life as cheap as humanly possible. But as inevitably happens, the end of his life started to make itself apparent. He knew he was reaching the end of his life, and he only had one person in his life that he cared most about, and that was his beloved wife, who had stood by him throughout everything. When most of their friends wondered how could she possibly stay with that cheapskate, she still stuck by him. They had no kids, they had no other family members, and so everyone believed that when he was finally laid to rest, she might very well become the wealthiest woman in town because of how much he had saved over his life. But what they didn't know was that her husband made one final request of his wife. As he was on his deathbed, he told his bride that since he had worked so hard for every single dollar that he had gotten, and since he had amassed such a great amount of wealth for himself, he wanted to be buried with every single penny he had to his name. He wanted all of his money placed in the casket with him. Sure, everybody says you can't take it with you, but this dude was out to prove that theory. Or test that theory, I guess. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Like, take a step back and really look at this, examine. Not only has this woman put up with all of his cheapness throughout their marriage together. She's had to live in that cheap house that he bought. She has had to live with hand-me-down clothing. Anytime that she was allowed to go shopping, she had to do it as cheaply as humanly possible. She has dealt with this her entire adult life. And now that her husband, the sole breadwinner for the family, has reached the end of his life, he's not only asking her to continue to do that, he's actually asking her to live through hardship for the rest of her life because she will not have the money that he made throughout his life if she carries out this final request. What a guy. The day of his funeral finally came, and by that point in time, word had kind of spread throughout this town about this final request of this husband. And everybody who attended the funeral noticed that his now widow sat in the very front row with a shoebox sitting on her lap. Everyone came to believe that this must be his money. They couldn't understand why she would be willing to do this sort of thing. They couldn't understand why this was finally going to happen. But every eye was on her as the preacher finished the last of his words, and the end of the funeral service itself made its way, and his widow got up, tears staining her eyes, gave her husband one last meaningful look, one final kiss on his cheek, and then placed that shoebox in the casket with him. This was too much for a friend of hers. At the dinner reception following the service, her friend approached her with righteous indignation, saying, "I can't believe that you actually did that. Why would you follow through on that pig-headed monster's final request?" All the widow could do was just look at her friend in the eyes with a look that said, "What else could I have done?" This friend finally needed to hear it from her mouth. She needed to understand that, yes, she did just do exactly what everybody thought that she did. She said, "So you really put all of that money in the casket with him?" The widow finally spoke, saying, "I love my husband. I wanted to honor his last request. But I couldn't find a big enough container to put all his money in, so I did the only thing that seemed sensible to me. I put all of his money in my checking account. And I wrote him a check. It's all there whenever he's ready to cash it." It's a humorous story, and I doubt its authenticity, but there's a part of it that just kind of makes sense, because we as human beings, sometimes we can be a little weird when it comes to things like our possessions and our money. Like we probably aren't going to go to the extreme that this man in this story was willing to go, but we tend to be a little bit guarded when it comes to the stuff of our lives. I'd love to stand up here and say that I don't have any hang-ups when it comes to my money or my possessions, but I know that I get a little nervous when people get a little too close to my comic book collection. I don't know how clean your hands are, and that's my retirement fund. So that's not to say that we're greedy. I'm not accusing anybody in here of greed or malicious intent. In fact, I genuinely believe that most of us in here, if we heard of someone who is in need or had some sort of problem going on, most of us would probably do whatever we could to help out in some small way. We'd be willing to give a little bit of our money to be able to help them out. But how far are we willing to extend that particular help? How far are we willing to go when we know that someone is in need? Let's take this a little bit further. In the church, we tend to refer to one another as our brother or our sister. But how far does that familial bond actually go for us? If we're talking about that first church, that bond went pretty darn far. As you know, for the last several weeks, we've been looking at this picture of unity found within the very first church, and we've been kind of challenging ourselves to see what we can find to be able to become just as united as they were, or at least grab some part of that unity within ourselves. We've been looking specifically at Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, but today I want to actually take a closer look at that text, because there's a portion of this text that it just sticks out to me. Look at this text with me again. It said, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, and to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe. Many wonders and signs were being performed through the apostles. Now all the believers were together and held all things in common. They sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and broke bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And every day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved." Now, every time I've ever read this particular passage, but certainly as we've been talking about this particular narrative and going in depth on it, there's always one particular part. Man, every time I see it, it just sticks out. My jaw opens a little bit wider every single time I read verses 44 and 45. It's something that you've seen already in this particular thing, but we've never really thought about this idea. It's such a strange concept for us. Again, it says, at the end of verse 44, it starts off saying they held all things in common. Verse 45 says they sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. Now, I'll be honest. The first time I ever read that particular phrase, held all things in common, my brain immediately associated that with the same way that most of us would associate in common with. Meaning that maybe they held the same ideas about Jesus and God and each other and all that stuff. That maybe that's what that meant when they said it was in common. But as I studied this and as I looked deeper into this, I realized that's not what that means. When it says that they held all things in common, it's actually talking about their possessions. It means that when this church told one another, "My house is your house," they meant it far more literally than we tend to. It means that nothing in their house was off limits to any one of their brothers and sisters. Need some extra flour? Go right ahead. Cup of sugar? It's in the jar. Need to borrow a power tool? Well, that hasn't been invented yet, but once it is, you got it, buddy. Everything was held in common. They didn't hold anything back from each other. And as unbelievable at times as that thought may be to us, verse 45, I think, takes the cake. Again, it says, they sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. I don't know about you, but I kind of need to sit down now after reading that particular idea. This is so different than anything else that we have a tendency to believe, right? This is a difficult thing for us to even start to fathom. That if anybody had a need, they could come forward and somebody was going to make sure that that need got met, no matter what it cost them. When somebody had a need and they came forward, people would willingly go and take the stuff of their house, the little knickknacks, the stuff that they worked hard to get, maybe something that had some meaning to them. Without hesitation, they sold it and brought the money in to take care of that need. Two things that this really shows me, I think, and hopefully it shows you as well. Two things that kind of stand out. First, somehow, some way that I don't think I'll ever understand, the church leaders of this particular first church were able to cultivate a type of setting where people felt comfortable enough that if they had some sort of a financial need, if there was something weighing on them, if there was something that was keeping them up at night, they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that they could go to the church leaders and express what their need is without fear of judgment or fear of shame. Wow. I don't know about you, but I've had some times in my life where I've faced some financial hardships and where, you know what, maybe I could have expressed that need to other people, but I wasn't about to go share that at church. I'm going to guess maybe that you are too. The second thing that really stands out to me here is just the overwhelming generosity of this particular church. And when somebody did express that need, when somebody felt comfortable enough to share, at the very least with the church leadership, that, hey, I've got a situation I'm going through and I could use a little help. That was all the prompting anyone needed for them to go home, gather up some of the clutter that they got going on, and have a yard sale. And sell that stuff in order to go and give it to somebody. We're talking about stuff that maybe they had to save up for. Maybe it was something they worked hard towards with the goal of being, I'm going to purchase this particular item. I don't know about you, I got stuff sitting in my garage that I have now, but it was a pipe dream at some point in time. That I knew I was going to have to save up for it. If you recall last Christmas I said I wanted a thickness planer. Well, I got a thickness planer, but I paid for it. So I had to save up for that. Those things aren't cheap. And yet, for somebody in this particular church, if somebody came with a need, they went home, they looked at their thickness planer and said, you know what, I can get a lot of money for that. And they just got rid of it. Simply because somebody had need. This shows that for those in this early church, their love for each other led them to do whatever it took to meet one another's needs. In fact, a little further in Acts chapter 4, verses 34 through 37, it kind of gives us a little more on this particular type of mindset. We'll start with verses 34 and 35, because it says, "For there was not a needy person among them, because all those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the proceeds of what was sold, and laid them at the apostles' feet. This was then distributed to each person who has need." Man, this goes a little further than what we see in Acts 2:45, right? Because when I read Acts 2:45, I thought, well, maybe this just means that people are just getting rid of some of the stuff. And I'll be honest, I've got a lot of clutter in my own house. I could afford to probably get rid of some of that stuff. And if selling it is going to benefit somebody else, then all the better. They took it even further than that. They were selling off real estate. They sold land. They sold houses in order to make sure that people's needs were met. Now, I want you to understand something here. This is a big deal. This is a time period where people who amassed land likely did so through generational accumulation, meaning that a family member purchased that land at some point in time and then passed it down. And somehow, some way, that way found its way to you. The likelihood is, the expectation is that land would also be passed down to your children on down the line. Now, we do some of this still to this day, but it's a little bit different. Because remember that this is still an agricultural-based economy, right? Everything as far as money goes usually revolves around what you can grow. So they're not just getting rid of land that provides them with food. They're not just getting rid of land that's going to help them out right now. They're not just selling the price of the land itself. They are willingly sacrificing any money that they would make off of it for years to come. They're sacrificing any money their children might make off this land. They're sacrificing generations of wealth that would come from this particular field. Why? Because somebody who they gather together and worship with has a need. Something has gone wrong, and they need a little help getting by. And you know what? Selling my field? Yeah, it's going to hurt, but I'm willing to pay that price. For Barnabas, he did this as well. Barnabas, of course, means son of encouragement. And how encouraging would this be when he sold a field that he owned? He brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet, just to meet the needs of somebody else. This dramatic effect of each and every member there, this willingness to sacrifice at a level that you and I can't really begin to understand, well, it paid off. Because again, as verse 34 says, there was not a needy person among them. Again, contextually, this is still under the rule of Rome. Taxation, we may think our taxes are pretty high. Living in Israel under Roman rule, you're lucky if you got half of what you make. They're experiencing poverty at a level that we can't even begin to comprehend. People are struggling. Many are turning to crime simply just to get by. And yet, in this church, there's not a needy person among them. Because everybody is making sure that everybody else is taken care of. There is nothing getting in the way. There's no sleepless nights wondering how you're going to be able to pay that bill. There's no wondering if the roof is going to be over your head tomorrow. There's no wondering, am I going to be able to eat tomorrow? There is nothing to get in the way of spending time together worshiping Jesus. I do want to pause for a second here because I think we need to point out that it's very clear here that it says it meets their needs, right? And we know that there's a world difference between need and want, right? It doesn't say that there was no one who didn't have a Gucci bag. It doesn't say there was nobody who didn't have a brand new shiny truck. It doesn't say there was no one who didn't get what they wanted for Christmas. I don't think they were celebrating Christmas yet. It's a little early. But they saw to one another's basic needs. They took care of each other's food, shelter, clothing. They weren't fulfilling one another's wish lists. They were making sure everyone had what they needed to survive so that nothing would stand in the way of their worship. They wanted to be absolutely sure that those they gathered together to worship with were taken care of. And if that meant having to part with stuff, even land, no problem. This begs the inevitable question, does it not? Why? Why were they willing to go this far? Why were they willing to do this level of sacrifice? Why were they willing to give this much? Maybe to people who they don't really know all that well, people who just started coming, maybe people who this is still a fairly large church. We're still in Jerusalem here, so this church is well over 3,000 that we know of. Maybe they've never actually met this person. And they're still willing to go to this extreme. Why? Why are they willing to do all of this? The more I think about it, the more I think about this overwhelming spirit of generosity within the early church, the only thing I can come up with is fairly simple. It's because they loved each other. It's because they cared about one another. It's because it was more than just a polite hello or a hey, sorry we didn't see you this week. They genuinely cared for one another. They shared a sense of love of Jesus, and because of that love, a love for one another that spilled out to the point that they were willing to part with whatever it took to make sure that somebody's need was met. And that love, that compassion, that heart strengthened the bonds of their unity. Because how could it not? Now, here's the thing. If you walk away today saying, I guess Brandon is telling us we got to go sell everything and bring it to the church, then you kind of miss the point here. I'm not saying that. I'm in no position whatsoever to tell you what to do with your possessions, just like you're in no position to tell me what to do with mine. But what I believe this particular text is showing us, what this particular notion is telling us, is that this is about our love for one another. See, it's fairly easy for us to fall into the trap of thinking that maybe Brandon is talking about our possessions, but I'm not. I think the reason why it's easy for us to think that is because we still have our weird hang-ups on our stuff. Don't we? Because I think if I genuinely said, I am saying sell all your possessions and bring the money here to the church, that next week we're going to be pretty light in here. It might just be me and Mandy. But it's about the love, the spirit of love that they held with one another. If we walk away believing this, we fail to understand what's really going on here. What I believe the first church was doing, what I believe led them to doing these sort of things, is simply because they cared for one another to that point that they wanted to make sure that everyone was taken care of. They loved each other so very much, so very deeply, that they wanted to make sure each other was taken care of. They prioritized people over possessions. And because of that love, because of that, their unity was strengthened to the point that they cared this much for each other. In the church, we use those phrases, brother or sister in Christ. It's something that you hear in every church you've ever been in. You're going to hear it in every church you'll ever go. But do we really mean it? See, I can't speak for you, but I know when it comes to my family, I want to make sure that their needs are taken care of for no other reason than I love them and I care about them. See, if something catastrophic were to happen to my brother and he lost everything, I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that he and his wife and their 2 kids are taken care of. If that means I got to sell off some stuff, if that means I got to cash in my comic book collection early, I'm not going to think much about it. It might hurt, but I'm going to consider it to be worth it, right? Because I love my brother. We have to ask ourselves the question, when we refer to one another as brother or sister, is that just a colloquialism, something that we say but we don't necessarily mean? Something that doesn't really have any weight behind it? Or is that something that spurns us to make sure that the needs of our brother and our sister in Christ are met? Do we genuinely love one another that if someone has a need, if someone has been bold enough to admit that they have a problem, are we willing to do what it takes to help meet their need? Or do we have such a tight grasp on all of our possessions and all of our stuff and all of our money that we'll just say, oh, I'll pray for you, and leave it at that? Again, I'm not saying everyone here needs to go home and stick a for sale sign in your yard. It's not what I'm doing. But what I am saying is that if we genuinely want to recapture the unity that we find within the early church, if we genuinely want to take this from just a flowery dream and turn it into a reality, it means that we have to be willing to place a much higher priority on people than we tend to do our possessions. It means that our love for our church family should be willing to go to the same lengths as our love for our biological family. Because again, I'm willing to bet that you got people in your own life that you're willing to go make sure that they got needs for you. They likely have the same last name as you, or at least you guys look a lot alike. Right? If we want to recapture the unity that we have within the church, that the first church demonstrates to us, it means that we can't use the phrase brothers and sisters without actually meaning it. It means we got to turn it from just stuff that we say into stuff that we mean. If someone comes before us and says, I've got a need, again, a need, not I want, but an actual need, our love for one another should spurn us to do whatever we can to meet that need. I'd like to think that for many of us, this is something that we could get behind. I'd like to think that if somebody here were really struggling right now, that we'd do what we could to help them, even if it meant parting with some stuff. But there is a world of difference between our belief that we mean when we say we call each other brother and sister, and actually meaning it when that need arises. Maybe today you need to do a little heart check. It's kind of that check-in with yourself, to find yourself asking that question, do you truly value people over possessions? Are you willing to part with the things in your life in order to see the needs of your brother or sister met? How far is your love for your brother or sister in Christ willing to go? My hope is that we seek to find our unity through our shared love for one another. The Apostle John wrote in 1 John 3:16 through 18, and we'll close with it this morning. He said, "This is how we have come to know love. He laid down his life for us. We should also lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has this world's goods and sees a fellow believer in need but withholds compassion from him, how does God's love reside in him? Little children, let us not love in word or speech, but in action and in truth."